The NHL Draft Lottery has concluded, and the Rangers are currently scheduled to pick 12th. However, should they keep that pick, or should they send it to the Penguins?
You're Locked on the New York Rangers, your daily podcast on the New York Rangers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, Blue Shirts fans, to episode number 1306 of the Locked On New York Rangers podcast. I'm your host, John Chick. Just want to thank you guys, as always, for making Locked On New York Rangers your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. And today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by Monarch Money. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off of your first year. And we are, of course, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So the NHL Draft Lottery has come and gone. It occurred on Monday night, and very interesting results, very interesting situation going into the draft lottery and coming out of the draft lottery for the New York Rangers. I'll explain what I mean by that in just a second, but to kind of go over the Rangers' position that they were in going into the draft lottery, they were the 11th of the 11 teams that had a chance to end up with the first overall pick in the NHL draft. That's the way they do it. The worse you do in the regular season, the worse record you have, the better of a chance you have of getting the number one overall pick. And with the Rangers, like I said, they were the 11th of the bottom 11 teams in the NHL, at least going by record. And that meant that they went into the draft with just a 3% chance of getting the first overall pick. That did not end up happening for the Rangers. But what did happen was the team with the 10th best odds out of the 11 teams of getting the first overall pick, that being the New York Islanders, they were the team that indeed ended up winning the draft lottery, and they will now pick first, which is unfortunate news to begin with, because obviously that's a Metro Division rival for the Rangers. But it really is crazy to think about. The Islanders only had a 3.5% chance of winning the lottery and picking first, and that's, of course, what ends up happening. And again, for comparison's sake, the Rangers had a 3% chance of winning the lottery and picking first. But what's really crazy about this is the Rangers missed out on getting the first overall pick by like that much. They were that close because, as some fans on social media have already pointed out, the Rangers went 4-0 against the Islanders this past season. Had the Islanders won any of those 4 games against the Rangers, then they would have finished ahead of the Rangers in the standings, and the Rangers would have finished behind the Islanders. It would have had to have been a regulation win, but regardless, if the Islanders had beaten the Rangers in regulation, they would have flip-flopped spots in the standings with the Rangers, and that would have meant that the Rangers would have been the team with the 3.5% chance of picking first, and that would have meant that the Rangers would have won the draft lottery. Right when you think that all the pain and suffering are over from this past season, and that they can't hurt us anymore. We got through it, all 82 games of whatever that nonsense was that we saw by the Rangers on a night in and night out basis this past season. Something like this happens. We can't enjoy anything. We can't have anything nice. One of the very few salvageable aspects of this past season is the very simple fact that the Rangers absolutely destroyed the Islanders. They went 4-0 against them. A lot of those games were not even close. And if nothing else, okay, well, at least we beat, our oldest and some would say greatest rival. And that's all well and good until this happened. Because again, if the Islanders had won even one of those 4 games, they would have been in a different position in the draft lottery. The Rangers would have won the draft lottery. They would have been picking first. So just unbelievable that this awful 2024-2025 season continues to just give us all a gut punch seemingly on the daily. But as far as the Rangers go and how they ended up picking 12th, these were the odds that the Rangers were faced with going into the draft lottery. Now, again, they were the 11th of the bottom 11 NHL teams, which meant that they had a very small chance of picking first, 3% overall to be exact. They also had a 3.2% chance of picking second and a 0.1% chance of picking third. Additionally, they had a 79.9% chance of picking 11th. So that was the most likely outcome. But of course, that's not what happened. They had a 13.4% chance of picking 12th, and that's where they ended up. And they also had a 0.5% chance of picking 13th. So you got all that? There's a test later. And now that nobody is confused, we can move on here. The other aspect that we have to talk about here is a big decision that the Rangers are now faced with. They now know that they are going to be picking 12th overall, and they have a decision to make whether they give the 12th overall pick this year to the Penguins or next year's first round pick to the Penguins, which, of course, we do not know when the Rangers will be picking in next year's draft because, of course, next season has not happened yet. But as far as how they got here, for anybody that needs a little refresher, a little recap on how the Penguins now own the Rangers' first round pick for either this year or next year, this happened when the Rangers struck their deal with the Vancouver Canucks. They got JT Miller. Part of the return package for the Canucks was a first-round draft pick. The Canucks then later traded that first-round draft pick to the Pittsburgh Penguins, which is not ideal for the Rangers. I'm sure all of us would have been a lot happier if the Canucks just held on to that pick. And, okay, we lost a first-round pick, but at least it's not going to a division rival. Be that as it may, obviously the Canucks are free to do whatever they want with that pick once they've traded for it. But the bottom line, now the Penguins do own a first-round pick that belongs to the New York Rangers, or previously belonged to the New York Rangers. And again, the kicker is that the Rangers have to decide, give the Penguins the number 12 overall pick this year, or give the Penguins the first round pick next year. And of course, you don't know when you're going to be picking next year. It's an interesting topic, and we're going to debate what the Rangers could, should, and ultimately will do. We will get to that in just a second. All right, we just want to take a minute to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by Indeed. You just realized your business needed to hire someone yesterday. How can you find amazing candidates fast? Easy. Just use Indeed. When it comes to hiring, Indeed is all you need. Stop struggling to get your job posts seen on other sites. Indeed's sponsored jobs put your posts at the top of the page and help you reach the right candidates much faster. We've all been in that position where we need to hire somebody like yesterday. The pressure's on, and every day without the right person is a setback. That's exactly when Indeed's sponsored jobs come in handy. They make sure your post is seen by the right candidates right now. Now you can speed up your hiring process with a $75 sponsored job credit. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring, Indeed, is all you need. All right, let's go ahead and keep everything rolling here on Locked On New York Rangers. Got to shout out the everydayers, as always, for sticking with this podcast through all the ups and downs of Ranger hockey. Going to be discussing in our next episode the impending Mike Sullivan press conference that is scheduled for Thursday at 10 a.m. We'll see what he says. We'll see what some of the takeaways are. How does he feel about this player, that player? Who might his assistant coaches be? Who might be the next Ranger captain, all that good stuff in the next episode of Locked On Rangers. And also in the very near future, going to be doing a crossover episode with Hunter and Patrick from Locked On Penguins. Going to be talking to them about all things hockey, but especially Mike Sullivan. Got some questions to ask them for sure. But for right now, let's go ahead and keep the focus on the 2025 NHL Draft, and more specifically, what the Rangers should do with the number 12 overall pick. Now, first of all, it must be said that the Rangers will have up until 48 hours before the NHL Draft begins to decide what they want to do. If they want to give the Penguins the number 12 overall pick this year, or keep this pick and give the Penguins their first-round pick next season. I did make a little bit of a mistake in the most recent episode. See, that's what I thought was going to happen. I thought they had up until 48 hours before the draft begins. But I saw a graphic that had it the other way. They have 48 hours after the draft lottery, and the former is correct. They will have up until 48 hours before the NHL draft. So just wanted to clarify that. Whatever they decide, I don't expect them to do it anytime soon, or at the very least, they won't reveal what their decision is anytime soon. Because to begin with, they might want to take some time to think this over. They don't have to rush through this. They might want to, do their homework on the prospects that are available in this year's draft. And, okay, well, who might be available at number 12? Do we think this guy will drop that far? Is there somebody around that area of the draft that we like a lot, that we'd like to, take a shot at perhaps drafting? So there's that to consider. But also, just tactically speaking, there's really no reason to let the Penguins know what the Rangers intend on doing until you absolutely have to. Now, I'm sure the Penguins, they know that the Rangers are picking 12th and that they might end up with that number 12 pick. So I'm sure they'll do their homework on the players. But again, Tactically speaking, it makes no sense for the Rangers to give the Penguins any more notice than they absolutely have to. So I would expect this thing to go right down to the wire. I mean, I don't see why you're the Rangers, why there'd be any real reason to reveal, what your intentions are until you absolutely must do it. The Rangers might decide privately what they want to do before the 48-hour deadline, but they're not going to let us know, I don't think, and not going to let the Penguins know either. So that's kind of where things stand as far as the decision-making has to go. As far as the decision, like, keep this pick or give it away to the Penguins, at first I thought this was an easy decision, and now I'm not so sure. I'm going to come up with a verdict at the end of this segment, but my way of thinking was, okay, go ahead and give away this year's pick, assuming you didn't end up picking first, which of course the Rangers did not. They have the 12th overall pick. So with it being the 12th pick this year, it feels like the much safer option to just give this pick to the Penguins and keep your first round pick next year, especially since you don't know when you're going to be picking in next year's draft. You don't know how next season is going to go. You don't know if you're in the lottery. You don't know how that's going to go either. There's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of wild cards for next year. And it feels like the much safer thing to do is just to give the Penguins the number 12 pick this year. And it's one thing to give up the number 12 overall pick, but if the Rangers were to stumble and do even worse next season, then yeah, you could end up giving the Penguins, if you keep this year's pick, you could end up giving the Penguins a top 5 pick, a top 3 pick next season. And I don't think any Ranger fan wants to see that. On top of that, and this kind of leads me into the next thing that I want to mention here, next year's NHL draft class is believed to be quite a bit better than this year's class. And obviously that's very subjective, and we never know how it's going to go with these players once they get to the NHL. But I do think most scouts are mostly on the same page that next year's class is better than this year's class. And that's another reason why it would make more sense, seemingly, to give the Penguins this year's pick rather than next year's pick. And one more reason that I'll throw out there, and this isn't the strongest reason of the ones that I'm mentioning here, but there's that part of me that says, you know what, just get it over with. It kind of sucks, let's be honest, that the Penguins are going to get a first-round pick from the Rangers. That's not what the Rangers signed up for when they traded for JT Miller and gave up the first-round pick. I still think the Rangers would do that regardless. But the Penguins now have a first-round pick from the Rangers. So my feeling on that, when you have something that you really just don't want to do, the best thing to do, I think, is just to get it done. Just get it over with. And that's kind of my way of thinking here. Like, okay, the Penguins are getting a first-round pick for the Rangers, so just take it this year, get it over with, and at least next year, like if the Rangers stumble in their first few games, we don't have to agonize over the fact that the Penguins own the Rangers' first-round pick for all of next season. It would just be better for all of our collective mental psyches to get it over with right here and right now. So as you can see, there were a lot of reasons here that I felt that the Rangers should give up this year's pick to the Penguins rather than next year's pick to the Penguins. However, the more I thought about this, the more I'm kind of on the fence. And like I said, I'm going to have a verdict at the end of all this. And there is that part of me that says, you know what? Keep this year's pick. Give the Penguins your pick for next year. Now, it is risky. Oh, God, is it risky? Because if things really implode next season, then not only do we have to deal with another miserable season of Ranger hockey, but like I said, we've got that sort of dark cloud hanging over all of us, knowing full well that even with the Rangers having a bad season next year, they don't even get their first-round pick, and the Penguins do. So that's just a miserable scenario to even think about. But at the same time, this is why I started to be on the fence about this a little bit. If you're the Rangers and you give the Penguins this year's pick and you keep next year's pick, wouldn't that sort of be a vote of no confidence in this Ranger team next year? Because if you're Chris Drury, to me, that's a tough sell to ownership. Drury made all these wheelings and dealings last season in the middle of the year, all these different trades, all these extensions, all this stuff, very few of which have really paid off in a big way, at least as of yet. And then he gets to hire Mike Sullivan in the offseason. We're going to retool this thing on the fly. We're going to be back next year. We're going to have a good season. We'll be back in the playoffs and all that good stuff. And if you really feel that way, if you're really Chris Drury and you really do have that kind of confidence in this Ranger team that they'll bounce back, that they'll be a contender next year, then why would you be so afraid of the Penguins getting your first round pick next year? Because if the Rangers really do bounce back, if they really do become contenders again, and if at the very least they at least get into the playoffs next season, then you don't have anything to be worried about. Because if you make it into the playoffs, the highest the Penguins can pick next season would be 17th. You're picking 12th this year. And I know that, yes, next year's draft class is a little bit better than this one. But I don't know if you're Drury and the Ranger front office and you decide to give away this year's pick and keep next year's pick, then that's kind of an indication that you don't really believe in this Ranger team next year. And it's also kind of an indication that you're kind of doubting your own moves. You're kind of doubting, do I really have this figured out? Is this really going to work next season? And this is a guy, again, who retooled this entire roster on the fly last year. I think it's going to continue this offseason. He got to hire a new coach, somebody that is very highly thought of, very well respected around the league, and Mike Sullivan. All signs are pointing to the Rangers believing in this thing turning around next season. And if you are scared to death of giving the Penguins your pick next year, then that indicates just the opposite, that you're not so sure that things are going to work out well. Because if the Rangers implode next year and have a terrible season, then obviously the Penguins end up picking quite a bit higher. So it's a lot to consider. And that's an option and an aspect of this whole thing that I hadn't really thought about that much in the past. And because of all these reasons, there is that part of me that's leaning toward bucking conventional thinking here and maybe keeping this year's pick. But one thing that kind of swayed me back in the other direction and now wants to give away this year's pick is the very simple fact that next year, the Rangers do not have a second round pick. So if you were to keep this year's first round pick, then you would go into next offseason not having a first round pick or a second round pick. That's pretty tough. And you can always trade, you can move this guy and that guy and bring in a draft pick, but that's not always easy to do. And you know, that's not a good situation, I don't think, for any draft, for any team, for any draft. You want to go into a draft without a first rounder or a second rounder, unless you traded those picks and it resulted in the team winning a Stanley Cup the year before, you could very easily make the argument that it's simply not worth it. So, you know, because of all these reasons, I started to consider maybe giving up next year's pick. But again, for all the reasons that I just mentioned, the fact that that would mean that the Rangers don't have a first or a second rounder next year, the fact that there's a better draft class next year, the fact that giving up the number 12 overall pick this year is quite a bit safer than giving up an unknown draft pick next season, and just the fact that you can get it over and done with this year, all those reasons kind of pulled me back into what I was originally thinking. I still think, despite everything I just said, that the best way to go is for the Rangers to give up the number 12 overall pick this year and hang on to the first round pick next year. Even though, as I mentioned a second ago, to me, that sort of indicates a little bit of indecision. It indicates a little bit of lack of confidence from this Ranger front office in the players to turn things around. But again, I think that the reasons for giving away this year's draft pick outweigh the reasons for giving away next year's draft pick. And I get the feeling most Ranger fans would agree with me. Certainly not all, but it's a lot to think about. It's a lot to consider. And I hope the Rangers are, you know, mulling this over and they're going to consider all their options here and come to a conclusion. Again, there's no reason to rush this decision. You don't have to reveal it until 48 hours before the draft, even if you decide before then. But it's a lot to think about, and I'm curious to think how you guys would play this. Would you give up this year's draft pick at number 12, or would you give up next year's draft pick at a position that we don't know what number it's going to be? Very curious to hear which way Ranger fans would go on this matter. But we're going to keep everything rolling in just a second to kind of stick with this theme of the NHL draft. There's something that we do going into every draft every year. We look at the Ranger first round draft pick and we look at a couple of different prospects, a couple of different candidates that the Rangers could potentially pick with wherever they happen to be picking. And at least as of right now, the Rangers still do own the number 12 overall pick. So we're going to spotlight a defenseman who I like quite a bit. We're going to do that in just a second and talk about, you know, his potential fit with the Rangers and if the Rangers might be interested in him. Like I said, we will do that in just a second. All right, we just want to take a minute to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by Monarch Money. Ever check your bank account and wonder, where did all my money go? Between dining out, online shopping, and entertainment, it is very easy to lose track. That is where Monarch Money comes in, your personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money is not just a budgeting app, it's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place. So you stop just managing your money and start building wealth. There's all-in-one convenience. Instead of juggling multiple apps, you can use Monarch to check your finances, track spending, and even plan long-term goals. There's easy collaboration. Managing your money with your partner is smoother than ever. You can track shared and personal accounts, set goals, and stay on the same page without all the stress. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off of your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNHL for half off of your first year. All right, let's go wrap up today's episode by talking a little bit more about this upcoming NHL draft. And more specifically, we're going to point the draft spotlight the first time we're doing this offseason. There will be a few more episodes just like this at a prospect of this upcoming draft that the Rangers could potentially take in the first round. Again, that is if the Rangers hang on to the number 12 overall pick, which they may or may not do. We will see. But the person we're going to spotlight here is defenseman Logan Hensler from the University of Wisconsin. It's funny, the way I decided to talk about Hensler today, I knew we were only going to have time for one draft prospect. So I just Googled NHL draft rankings and I said, you know what? The first list that I click on, I'm just going to go with whoever's number 12. And it just happened to be Hensler. So he's somebody that could certainly be there when the Rangers pick. And it's funny because actually in yesterday's episode during the YouTube live chat, when the episode was premiering, one of you guys mentioned Hensler, and lo and behold, here we are talking about him on the first, draft-centric episode that we're doing this offseason. But to begin with, just the idea of drafting a defenseman, I certainly don't mind that because I feel like the Ranger cupboard is getting a little bit bare when it comes to defensemen. There's a lot of Ranger defensemen on the current roster that are facing uncertain futures with this team, and there's also a lack of bona fide big-time prospects at the defenseman position for the Rangers. They've done a decent job restocking it in recent seasons with Drew Fortescue as well as EJ Emery. Fortescue is a former third-round pick from 2023. He's played 2 seasons at Boston College. And Emery, former first-rounder in 2024, he has played 1 season at the University of North Dakota. But as far as defenseman prospects, that's just about it. I mean, Victor Mancini was obviously part of the deal that brought in JT Miller, and I still think that's a deal that you have to make. But bottom line, Mancini's gone now. It's also entirely possible that Keandre Miller and or Zach Jones could be playing elsewhere next season. They're both RFAs. It is far from a guarantee that either or both of them will be back. And as far as looking at free agency, the Rangers don't have a ton of cap space, so that's the first hurdle. But, there's people that want to throw out names like Provorov or Gavrikov, and sure, yeah, you could make a run at one of those guys. But by the very nature of this year's free agent class, which is not really that deep, especially at the defenseman position, I get the feeling that whoever gets either one of those defensemen is probably going to overpay a little bit. They're good defensemen. They definitely are. They're not superstars. And I get the feeling, you're looking at, I think at the least, both those guys are going to get $6 or $7 million per season. I think it could be that high. That also factors in the idea that the salary cap is expanding year by year. It seems to be building, very gradually, slowly but surely. And that being the case, I think those guys are going to get paid, and I think the Rangers might get priced right out of it. So you really don't have a lot of options as far as defensemen. And like I said, I do like the idea of kind of restocking the cupboard, so to speak, when it comes to defensemen. On one hand, and some people might argue this, when it comes down to whether it's the Rangers or whatever team or wherever they might be picking in the draft, there are some people that say, you know what, just pick the best player, worry about position later. And you can certainly make a case for that. But if the Rangers want to go position specific in the first round, I'm looking at defensemen. And with all that said, let's talk about Hensler a little bit here. 18 years old. He played the 2024-2025 season, like I said, with the University of Wisconsin. Did I mention that yet? I think I did. So he played with Wisconsin as a freshman, 32 games, 2 goals, 10 assists. He's a -13 and has 30 block shots as a freshman. Was also, I found this interesting, the 5th youngest player in all of college hockey, and he was named to the All Big Ten freshman team. So one of the better freshmen, obviously, in the Big Ten Conference. He also represented the United States at the most recent World Juniors, played in all 7 games for the U.S., had 1 assist, was an even plus-minus, and helped the team win the gold medal. He did have a small role on this team. He usually, looking at the box scores, I didn't remember this offhand. I obviously had to look back. Most of the box scores, he had the least amount of ice time of any United States defenseman. And the U.S., at least in some of their games, were going with 7 D-men. And so there were a couple of games where he didn't play that much at all, maybe 7 or 8 minutes. But regardless, obviously a very young player and at least had something of a hand in the United States winning the gold medal in that tournament. And there's a lot to like about Hensler, 6'2", 196 pounds. So obviously some good size, could still be filling out a little bit as well. So he might grow into his body even more than he already has. And looking at a list of draft publications, I had a list of 15 of them in front of me earlier today. All of the ones that I looked at, all the ones that were listed on this page, had Hensler ranked between number 11 and number 31. So there's a very good chance, no guarantee, not by a long shot. All it takes is one team to bite, but there's a very good chance that Hensler will be available to the Rangers if they hang on to that number 12 overall pick and don't trade up or trade down or anything like that, that he will still be there for the Rangers in this year's draft. As far as the scouting reports go, I figure I'll let these guys kind of give you guys the skinny on this player. They do this for a living, and they do a heck of a job with it. We'll start with Luke Sweeney of Dauber Prospects. This is what he had to say about Hensler. There was a lot of hand-wringing about Hensler's lack of production to start the year, even though he hasn't changed into an offensive force, thanks in part to a steady performance at the World Juniors. We're still high on his upside. Hensler's greatest strength is his rush defense. All right, let me just stop there for a second. That already sounds awesome. Draft him, case closed, end of story. The Rangers were so bad against the rush this past season that anybody that can provide good defense against the rush, that's music to my ears for me and probably for a lot of you guys as well. But anyway, continuing here. Hensler's greatest strength is his rush defense, which is easily among the best in the class. He's proactive in breaking up plays in both the neutral zone and when pinching. Hensler has a very timely defensive stick and closes gaps in a smooth, controlled fashion. Standing at a lanky 6'2", what defensive areas Hensler does need to shore up can largely be accomplished by growing into his frame and building that strength. As Hensler is such a strong defensive... Okay, let's try that again. As Hensler is such a strong defensive base to build on, we feel confident projecting him as a top 4 defender. So that's a pretty solid review there from Mr. Luke Sweeney of Dauber Prospects. We'll go to a couple more here before we call it. This one comes to us from Neutral Zone. Logan Hensler is a smooth skating two-way defenseman with a highly projectable frame and strong foundational skills. His mobility, size, and poise with the puck make him a potential top 15 draft pick for the 2025 NHL Draft. While he is already excelling in key areas, further consistency in his decision-making and defensive scanning or pre-reads could elevate him into a top 10 potential selection. And this article went on to, they do player comps. They compared him to Charlie McAvoy and said a smooth skating, intelligent defenseman who excels in all zones and is reliable. And we'll do one more here. This one comes to us from Jason Bukala of Sportsnet. I feel like he's scraping the surface of his overall ability. There's a real chance he might end up only providing depth offense at the pro level, but his quickness combined with his size and work ethic project Hensler as a shutdown defender at worst. So I like that. I mean, because by all accounts, reading through all these different scouting reports, and there's more than just this. You guys can certainly look up some more information on Hensler if you'd like. But it seems like his offense hasn't been there quite as much as people thought it might be in his first season at Wisconsin. I mean, I didn't see him play or anything, but maybe you chalk that up a little bit to wanting to be certainly a reliable defensive defenseman first and making sure you don't make any mistakes in that regard. Don't get caught pinching in the offensive zone and, obviously give up, goals or whatever it might be on the other side of the ice. So there's that. But at the very least, it sounds like this is somebody that's got some size, got some strength, has good hockey IQ, and at the very least projects as a top 4 defenseman in the NHL and should be somebody you could go to in a shutdown role. So I think these, scouting reports are very, very encouraging. It kind of sounds like somebody who has a very safe floor and a decently high ceiling as well. So if he's there at number 12 and if the Rangers hang on to that pick, he is somebody that I think they should consider. Now, again, despite everything I just said here, I still think the right play for the Rangers is once again to let the Penguins have the number 12 overall pick this year and hang on to their first round pick next year. But there's no guarantees that the Rangers are going to do that. And with that being the case, we will continue to look at other options at number 12 for the Rangers. Maybe we'll do it a little bit less this offseason than in off seasons past, just because there's no guarantee that the Rangers will hang on to that pick. But certainly we'll take a look at it and discuss some other options that the Rangers have there if they do indeed hang on to the number 12 overall pick for this year's draft. But we can call it there. If you guys would like to get in touch with this podcast, please send an email to lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Once again, that is lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Definitely give us a follow on Twitter as well at jchick17. Once again, that is at jchik17. And definitely subscribe to the Locked On New York Rangers YouTube channel. Thanks again, guys. I will see you next time.